Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third CME Palooza Spring session. Conundrums and CME, you be the jury, session sponsored by Helio CME. Our panel today is Andrea Funk from the Global Education Group, Melissa Wiles from Iridium Continuing Education, and Carrie Roberts from Steward Healthcare. First two sessions were all tech-based, so we're going to move in a different direction for this one. So thanks everyone for joining us. But before I turn things over, of course, we have to go through all of our sponsors. A big thank you to our gold sponsors, Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, ACHL, Clinical Education Alliance, and MedLearning Group. Our silver sponsors, Academic CME, DKB Med, Haymarket Medical Education, Helio CME, Platform Q Health Education, Red Med Ed, and Talum Health. And our bronze sponsors, Antidote Education Company, Bonum Continuing Education, CMEology, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Infograph Ed, and Iridium Continuing Education, MedIQ, PrimeMed, Peerview Institute for Medical Education, RMEI Medical Education, Vindico Medical Education, and Right Medicine. Three different ways that you can ask questions. You can use the CME Palooza text line to send in a question, 267-6660-CME or 0263. You can also tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. And you could use the little YouTube chat function if you want to click on the Watch on YouTube button that's on the lower left corner of where you're watching. You can do that. A good amount of people have been doing that. They've been sending them all the way, so however you do it, I will monitor all of them and make sure your questions get to our panelists. We will be using Poll Everywhere today, so make sure you have that ready. A big thank you to Creative Educational Concepts for sponsoring our audience response system. Just a reminder, you can either use the Poll Everywhere app, which is CME Palooza 005, or you can go ahead and plug in this URL, www.pollev.com/CMEPalooza005 into a web browser and use it that way. I think we have 3 questions today, so you can get ready for those. And then lastly, our speaker disclosure slide. Any opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Andrea. Andrea, take it away. Andrea, you are muted. Yes, yes, we got it out of the way right away. First one. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody will now hopefully learn from my example. Exactly. Thanks so much, Derek. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. I'm joined by my co-presenters, Melissa and Carrie Roberts, for our presentation, Conundrums in CME, You Be the Jury. We've set up this session to kind of mimic, kind of like a trial, prosecutor, defense, and then allow for polling questions for all of our wonderful attendees to be the jury to kind of assess which direction that they think the quote-unquote argument should go in. With that, I guess we can go ahead and get started if everybody's ready. Our first session that we will be discussing is the desired level of outcomes. Carrie Roberts is the prosecutor in this particular session.
Great, thank you very much. To start out this morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the CME Gold Standards of Outcomes is the collection of data and information about the changes that result in educational interventions, including changes in what it expects the learners to make, changes that the learners actually make, and the impact on patients. In CME, we reference Moore's framework, where the highest desired level of outcomes is knowledge, competence, performance, and patient outcomes. We can achieve this standard by evaluating electronic medical record data that shows patient-reported outcome measures before an educational activity, and then again after the activity to show the impact that the activity had on the improvements of those measures. Let's go to Exhibit A. Oh, there we go. Okay, this is a great example of clinically meaningful change before and after a CMA activity. My client provided this, and I have no background where it came from. So don't, if you did this, congratulations, it's amazing. However, accredited providers need to work hand in hand with their institution's data manager, quality improvement team to acquire data to show clinical meaningful change. We all know that healthcare institutions are willing to put a lot of resources into CME programs, and to be able to collect appropriate data, show meaningful changes.
Objection.
Andrea, do you want to make a statement on? Are we sustained or overruled?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's sustained.
Okay, all right, okay, fine. I guess everybody doesn't have all this money like some of these programs do. I know I don't have very much money in our program. So moving on. With the next slide, we can see that if the best way to get outcome in an activity is to make sure that it's interactive. And in this slide, we can see that it's really great to have the activity online. In person, it's great too, but with the activity, you need to make sure that you're having some type of an interactive workshop. So as you follow this chart down, you can see that if you have an online interactive program, that's a great way to get outcomes. If you have an in-person interactive workshop with simulations or different ways to get the group inspired to work and collaborate with the different activities. Then with the next section, you can see that there's different ways to have multiple media slides or have multiple presentations, just different ways to get the group interacted and get everybody to come together and work towards this activity instead of just being a passive learner. So in conclusion, patient outcomes are the holy grail of achieving outcomes in CME. It's important that CME programs validate their effectiveness by showing that all educational interventions are making measurable changes in patient outcomes. Healthcare systems have vast amount of data in their electronic medical systems. By harnessing this power of this data, with the data manager, you can show these great strides that your activities programs are achieving. Or by creating high impact activities, you can show how your learner progressed through the learning by interacting with the information and has gained competence and knowledge that will in turn affect performance and patient outcomes. The jury, I hope you see my point of view. Thank you.
Oh, now Melissa's muted. We're learning. Technology is hard today.
Okay, great. I was just very enthusiastic and excited. So I'm going to do the defense's argument now. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And give me 1 second. Got dueling slides here. So as the prosecution has informed you, the ACCME has emphasized criteria that focuses on improving competence, performance, and patient health status. And I think we all can agree that CME should not be an end in of itself, but as expressed in Moore's pyramid here to really help improve both individual patient health and performance. While the defense is supportive of this intent, we also believe that current approaches in terms of planning and assessing CME may not measure up to that intent in all cases. And so in this presentation, the defense is going to challenge both the judge and jury to step outside of that paradigm and think about ways which we actually do measure outcomes and what makes it difficult. So next slide, please. And we're going to ask, are we asking too much, too often for performance and patient health outcome? CME provides a framework in terms of their work of really looking at individual activities. And many of these educational activities are delivered as a single session topic and delivered over a point of time or a related sessions over a period of time. And they are often provided to an audience that is geared, that is brought to a certain target audience rather than unified by an organizational unit or a community and that kind of thing that we see at symposia. And so for starters, so I think we can all agree that outcomes and patient health is very challenging to measure. And for starters, you need to determine what is a competent in a particular subject matter. And then you need to actually measure the learners, what they bring, what level they are when they come and enter the activity. If learners are absorbed in the new valuable information from the CME activity, or did they get it elsewhere outside of the learning when you go back to measure whether performance, your activity measured performance. And importantly, you need to tease out, is the activity that you actually that they participated in, is that what resulted in the behavioral change, or was it forces outside of the activity? And so there's all these confounding variables that can be very difficult to tease out. Next slide, please. So, and another way of saying that is outcomes are determined not necessarily by the physician knowledge, competence, and performance alone, but they may be due to the performance of other healthcare professionals, the systems and processes which they operate, their environments, and by the ability of patients to comply. How do they show up to, or when do they show up in the continuum of care? And that all can be impacted by social determinants of health. So as much as I would love to say CME providers, the programs that we do impact patient outcomes and patient health, we can't always tell. So we can't take all the credit or all of the blame, because it's very hard to tease out all of these individual factors. Next slide, please. And so this is just a quick look at, as I was mentioning, here is the individual healthcare provider, but they are, one player in the bigger team and in the environment, and all of the things that must come into play and interact so that they can truly change performance and impact patient outcomes. Next slide, please. So there are many, there's also many dimensions of desirable outcomes. I think a lot of us have calls where thought leaders don't even agree on guidelines and standards. There are often very many priorities, such as cost benefit analysis, that physicians and clinicians need to keep in consideration when they're making treatment decision nowadays, and more so with managed care considerations. I think shared decision making of patients is more and more at the forefront of healthcare providers' minds, and what a patient wants might not be in completely alignment with the best practices. And there also has to be considerations for population health and societal issues. Next slide, please. And I think this is probably going to be the most unpopular thing, and I'm expecting to get some questions on this, but I think that we have all, strive to get level for outcomes in our programs more often than not. But I want to make the argument that sometimes knowledge is what we should be striving for and measuring for our activities. In the case surrounding basic research, sometimes we are trying to make awareness that a disease exists if it's a rare disease situation. Often in micro learning activities, where activities are mapped to one learning objectives, that one more learning objective may just be knowledge based. And there are also some non-clinical competencies that we might want to make learners aware of that may just be knowledge based. So I think that there is a time and a place for knowledge based, but it really just depends on the scope of the program. And I think we should keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Voting.
So the question that we ask you guys at this point in time, please do participate and vote, is to what level do you agree with the following statement? The level of outcomes for CME activities should be level 5 or higher. Oh, everybody's all over. This is kind of fun. All right. It looks like largely, or 30% have said disagree. But we do have some contenders who agree, people who are neutral. Wow. I'm surprised by these results.
Definitely.
Next slide, Derek. So ultimately, the conclusion is there's not necessarily just one good outcome. Outcomes are determined based on the gaps and how you plan on closing these gaps. So there's really no wrong answer. It's really very unique to the programs. Next slide. Things to keep into consideration is that there are always going to be various components that affect your outcomes, such as we all have learners, I think, who are just credit seekers. They need those credits. This might not be their therapeutic area, but the credits, CME, CE credit to them might just be what they need to renew their licensure for the time. Financial considerations. Sometimes there's not enough finances to support an activity that allow for higher level measurements of outcomes, understanding that, above and beyond really level 4, it takes additional resources. It takes additional follow-up with some of the learners. It takes additional analysis. It can absolutely take a minute. And then obviously method of participation. There are popular learning formats that we're starting to see more and more. I know that people have discussed in the past microlearning. It's really hard to get learners to then go back after that education and complete the evaluation application for credit, when it could be something as simple as 15 minutes. It was taken on the go. Maybe they were on a train. Maybe they were just microwaving popcorn, really anything. So at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not a learner, but you might not have all the data that you need to provide more thorough, detailed outcomes. Next slide. So as we kind of concluded, outcomes should not be a one size fits all. It's all unique to identifying your gaps, trying to close those gaps, and then considering the format of your education. It does look like we have some questions. Somebody asked, if an activity isn't designed to impact outcomes, why do it? Carrie, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I did. A lot of the times it seems like when we're asked to do an activity, it's because it seems like that there's some political background of it. A lot of times, at least that's for me. I come from a health system. So, Dr. So-and-so's visiting and, oh, we need to have him speak. And it's not something we necessarily need, but something that kind of happens. Another reason would just be, a lot of times I just feel like that we just get speakers. I don't know. What do you guys feel about it? Do you guys have programs like that?
I think, in my opinion, is that when you look at Moore's pyramid, I think about it as a step, and you're constantly stepping up the pyramid there. And just like Maslow's hierarchy of need, you need to move. Learners all enter that at a different point, and sometimes knowledge is as far as you're going to move in an individual learner, in that particular program, or, competence or something like that. So I don't think it's that you don't develop it with, that intent in mind, but then you just need to be aware that learners enter onto the pyramid, if you will, at different places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In the interest of time, I think we can move on to the next slide, please.
Okay, great.
Take it over. Take it away.
Okay, great. I will do the prosecution's argument for don't believe the generational learning preferences myth. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. So we are at a place where we have about 5 generations of learners in the workforce now, and primarily Gen X and millennials make up a big portion of the workforce now. And if you go to the next slide, please. In order to believe that, I think you have all heard the many generational myths that we should adapt our learning style, our learning methods to their learning styles. And I think in order to accept this generational thinking, one must have to find the way to swallow that tens of millions of people born over 20 years are fundamentally different from people of other age groups, and that those tens of million people are similar to each other in meaningful ways when it comes to learning. And so I just really like this quote because, I think it really sums it up, the argument up nicely. Next slide, please. So, and regardless of how popular and widespread the concept of generational learning style differences are, it's just not supported by science at this particular time. And I think a lot of these generational differences can be explained by other causes, such as age and period effects and scientific. A lot of the studies or things that are published have scientific flaws, and I think maybe what we're seeing is the cohort effect rather than generational differences. And the crux really is the major question here is whether generational differences is important enough a variable to be considered when we're designing the method of instruction over different technologies. And at this time, the weight of the evidence is negative. Next slide, please. And then one final thought here is that instead of calling out generational differences, I think we need to be careful because diversity and inclusion can cast a wide net in healthcare and in the workplace. And I think we need to be careful of, really using labels by age and that kind of thing, and really look at our audience as adult learners and decide what are we trying to, gaps are we trying to fill, and what is the best methodology based on sound adult learning principles to bridge that gap. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Carrie to defend her point of view.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely think that we need to be aware of people's learning styles. So go ahead and next slide, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for years, the CME community has been stuck in the past, offering archaic learning formats like grand rounds, conferences, and recorded presentations with no learning interaction. Okay, y'all don't kill me here. However, less and less of these doctors see the value of these learning formats and prefer more interactive education types that are timely and more individualized and interactive. Over the past years, physician learning has changed. As the baby boomer generation, they only had lectures and hands-on learning available, whereas our new learners, Gen X and millennials, a lot of the times the millennials have grown up always knowing computers. As a Gen Xer, I kind of grew into the computers, but our learning changed from books into computers. Look at the changes between, for some of us, high school where you had books, and then you get into the college type of environment and it's all computers. In fact, I just recently finished my master's, and it's been crazy with how much it was all on the computer. There were no textbooks. I kind of felt like I needed one, but I got over it. Let me propose a new idea when thinking of learning formats. Next slide, please. Doctors don't want to be spoon-fed information by a lecture. Doctors want to learn by participating in the education. So we need to look at the statement of meeting the physician where they are or where they can participate. Let's think about different ways that we can get them to follow our activities with more interaction and individualized learning. So let's look at some learning activities and kind of how we can adapt those to our different generations. Next slide. Enduring materials. There is so many amazing online enduring materials, but one thing that we need to think about is shorter lengths or chapters. We need to think about making the information more assimilable or assimilate. They can assimilate it quicker. So think less YouTube and more TikTok. So don't think of these big hour-long chunks because those are hard for people to get through. These little short 3 to 10 minute type of things are a little bit easier for people to handle. Create interactive activities and then add more. Consider scenarios instead of test questions. And one of my favorite video simulations of all times was the opioid training done by the health.gov website. It was so impactful. And I get that it took a lot of money to put together, but it's one that I'll always remember, just because it had video vignettes, and then you made a decision. And depending on that decision, it changed the video vignette. And I was so upset about the way my patient outcome was. I had to go back and redo it. If you've done this, let me know in the chat, because it was a really moving simulation. If you haven't, I did put the website up, and hopefully Melissa and Andrea, I don't know if you've had time in the last couple of weeks to look at it, but it was seriously impactful. Also, consider the production value of recording live events. As you can see, Derek and Scott do an amazing job with CME Palooza. It has great video quality, but just think if you've got, somebody's cell phone sitting up there recording something, just think about trying to get through that. You need to make sure that things are engaging and people actually feel like they're learning something and not just being spoon-fed the information. Next slide. Okay, y'all, we're going to talk about something a little bit controversial, but hear me out for a second. So let's talk about committee learning. So just as a definition, the ACCME defines committee learning as a live activity that involves a learner's participation in a committee process addressing a subject which, if taught learned in another format, would be considered within the definition of continuing education. Okay, so how is this learning? Let's talk about this. Okay, let's say, CME Program A has found a practice gap around surgery site infection. Decide to do a conference on various surgery site infections, how to prevent those infections. Part of the conference includes a panel of experts in infection control, antimicrobial stewardship, and quality improvement. This conference takes a lot of staff time. This takes a lot of money. This takes a lot of resources. Okay, now CME Program B, the underdog, has a monthly medical executive committee meeting where it brought up that there's an increase in surgical site infections. At this meeting, the physician representatives from the surgery department, as well as many other different hospital departments, also infection prevention, quality improvement, and antimicrobial stewardship. They discussed the increased incidence of surgical site infections, why they think they happened, research on all the solutions of what they can think of, what they've heard from other hospitals, and how they've reduced the incidence. In this meeting, they decide together as a group that they're going to tackle surgery site infections this way, and they decide to take it out to all of these different meetings, their department meetings, to discuss what they discussed in this meeting. Now, what's the difference between A and B learning format? Both groups learned about surgery and site infection, how to prevent the infections. One was in a formal, conference format. The other was more an organic committee learning format. So now, which group of doctors is going to be more willing to help employ what they learned? From my experience, the committee learning, the doctors who were part of the solution were way on board with these different agendas and the different programs that we had going on. And they were more invested in making sure that we help with that hospital initiative. The things that I've seen with committee learning, the doctors are much more on board. They want to participate, they want to make a change, because we can see those changes when we go back to that medical executive committee meeting and say, hey, over the last few months, how have our surgery site infections gone? Oh, they've gone down because, surgery decided to do this and infection control decided to do this. And we all work together and achieve this. And I think this really speaks to kind of the Gen X and the millennial way of thinking, that, they want to get together as a team. They want to get together and make these changes. They want to be a part of the solution. And so I think that committee learning, even though a lot of people don't see it as education, I really hope that you change your view and see it as true education, because I really think that we can have a lot of measurable changes. And I could go on about this more, but in the lieu of time, I will stop, because Andrea's going to start just flipping slides as Derek did. Okay, so the next point that I'd like to make is another thing that the new Gen X and the millennial doctors just love is internet searching and learning. My doctors love it in my system. We've had systems like UpToDate or Dynamed. They can search for issues that they're having with a patient when they need it, as they need it, get solutions, and then these programs make sure to keep track of their time. so that they're able to get their CME credits this way. It's been a really great learning modality. So let me switch to my closing, and then I'll go ahead and answer questions when we're ready. So the prosecution will have you believe that CME learning formats can continue and not change regardless of the new generations of learners that have grown up with this on-demand information. As educational leaders, we need to create learning formats that fit the needs of our learners. And we need to understand that as a baby boomer, they're not as comfortable with technology all the time. And we need to make sure that we take care of that. And we also have things for them. We also need to make sure that we're also looking at the Gen Xers and the millennials as to teaching in the ways that they assimilate information best. Thank you very much. Do we want to do jury voting, or do we want to go for some of these questions?
While Derek sets up, if he wants to set up the poll for everybody, if you want to answer that last one that just came in. So somebody had asked, how frequently do you do committee learning activities? That was directed to Gary.
Committee learning activities that the committee learnings that my system has are monthly or quarterly. We have MEC meetings that are monthly, of course, because of the bylaws within our hospital systems, but we also have some that are quarterly. The thing that's been amazing with these, and I'll have a really short soapbox, Andrea, so it's all good, is we've really seen some definite changes within our system. We're seeing that information is flowing up through our leadership because we're able to take information up through the MEC to our CMO meetings, and then CMO meetings are able to send information down through the MEC and department meetings. So it's really been great. And I'm tracking our leapfrog scores to see how this goes. And I'm really excited, but I've seen a little smidgen of changes. So I'm really excited, and I'll get off that soapbox.
We go on to our next question for the jury. To what level do you agree with the following statement? Generational difference is a variable important enough to be considered during the design of instruction or the use of different educational technologies. Looks like the group is largely agreeing.
Awesome. Come on, guys, we can see the light. We can make the change.
Excellent. So I think at the conclusion of this is that learning methodologies will continue to adapt, regardless, I think, of the generations. I think there's other things to take into consideration during, the pandemic or the height of the pandemic. Everything went digital. We started to identify that Zoom fatigue was a thing. People's time was a thing. It's never going to be just a one size fits all. While generations are important to consider, just based on, as Carrie pointed out, technology, a little bit of resistance to change in some older generations with the use of technology. There'll always kind of be that progression forward. Next slide. So as we all know, oh, sorry, I actually had to remove some slides. Sorry, next slide, Derek. So as we all know, education is most effective when it's useful and relevant. So again, we're identifying those gaps and we're trying to close those gaps. It builds on and uses a learner's own skills and experiences, as Carrie kind of pointed out with committee learning. And then it helps the learners achieve the objectives. And at the end of the day, once we've achieved those objectives, we're trying to close those gaps, which ultimately are going to kind of affect our patient population. Next slide. So this was just kind of a reminder to everybody on the model for instructional design, the ADDIE model, which I think we're all kind of familiar with. But again, when it comes to generational gaps, for sure we're going to see those. We're going to see some resistance to change. We're going to see some desire for different types of education. I, for one, will be very excited when education is presented in the form of a TikTok and we see doctors doing a little dance, giving a little bit of education, but we're not quite there yet. I think we will get there, hopefully sooner rather than later. With that, we'll move on to our third and final argument. I will turn it over to Melissa.
There, I'm trying to find the disappearing mute button. There we go. So I will talk about the prosecution argument for bigger numbers and bigger reach and bigger impact. And next slide, please. So I think, and as the OSP definition and has really clarified, there are many definitions of what across the various CME groups have in terms of what a learner is. And I have listed some of them. And I think just as a profession, I think it would be great to see more CME providers be aware of the OSP definitions and to get to a point where we're all sipping the same Kool-Aid, if you will, in terms of how a definer is learned. And I think that that's an important piece to understand before we even kind of get into the larger discussion of the reach of things. Next slide, please. I think just as I feel like we keep saying over and over again, it's really what is the goal of CME. And so in terms of an activity, if we're trying to increase knowledge and change and behavior and practice, if it is something that is a problem in the society as a whole, very much like at the beginning of the pandemic, the reach is very important. The more learners and the higher potential has the higher potential to increase knowledge. And we really want to extend beyond just CME that's peer-to-peer and exchange of information, but can get out information to the masses. And so I think, reach can be an important factor, and it really just depends on what education that we're trying to get out when we have new guidelines, and we're really trying to get that information to a broad group and adopt quickly. That's very important. So I think that there is value in just the reach of a particular educational activity. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie, or is it Andrea? Sorry, Andrea. Next slide.
Yes.
There you go.
So then the defense's argument for this is that smaller numbers are going to equal a greater impact when it comes to our definition of a learner. Next slide, please. So targeted education is going to identify a gap in a learner population that perhaps is going to be a little bit more hyper-specific with regards to the type of healthcare practitioner treating that. When you have those more hyper-specific target audiences, you're going to have to adjust your audience generation tactics to particularly address that population, that HCP population. We've seen this done by people tapping into societies, associations, academia to really hone in and find those healthcare practitioners that we're trying to help close that gap. With that said, when the gap is so hyper-specific, these learner numbers are often small. Next slide. So the argument being made that even though these learner numbers are smaller, just because of you're targeting very specific group of learners, that the impact is actually greater. Not only are you identifying the learner that you're trying to help, close this gap on, but then at the end of the day, you can infer that you're also affecting that specific patient population, since you're actually targeting the healthcare practitioner who is treating the patient population where you've identified the gap. So while you might have an activity that has 10 learners, you might have the correct learners, the actual learners that you were trying to target, which then you could make the argument that it is going to, positively impact patient outcomes without really having to formally measure patient outcomes, just because you're hitting that needle or that nail, I guess, right on the head. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on to our jury voting for this particular one on whether or not larger numbers are better or smaller numbers, and when is it important, or does it even matter? So for this particular question, we are going to ask, to what level do you agree with the following statement? The successfulness of a CME activity doesn't need to be exclusively dependent on learner volume. I feel like this should have music.
Mm-hmm. I can't decide if it's Jeopardy or like a Judge Judy.
Right.
Or Wapner. It's Wapner, People's Court.
There you go. That's better. I agree.
Yeah.
Ooh, so it looks like our jury strongly agrees to agrees largely. Nobody disagreed, which is fantastic. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Carrie for the conclusion of this third and final segment.
So yeah, the conclusion to this is that the success of a program will be largely determined on its ability to close the identified need or gap. I mean, if you have a large program and you're hitting all the people that you need to, and those learners are hitting the identified gap, that's great. One example that Andrea gave, if you are trying to hit a smaller gap and you're hitting the wrong target, it's not necessarily helpful either. So next slide, please. So yeah, like we were saying, large numbers are great where there's a large group. If this is for primary care, for PCPs, for hospitalists, if it's a large number, then that's fantastic to have a large number because that's the audience that will make the changes. But if you have smaller numbers where it's specialists like pediatric cardiologists, vascular surgery, rheumatologists, groups like that, or we always talk about, where you have, you need dentists, but you've got the wrong group. So it just really depends on, if you want the smaller numbers, if they're the ones that are going to be able to make the impact, then definitely that's the group you need. Andrea, do you have anything to add to this?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, again, it goes back to kind of identifying those gaps and trying to close those gaps. And at the end of the day, there are situations, again, 2020, I think we all wanted to disseminate as much COVID education as possible. And the bigger the numbers, the better, because everybody was affected. All hands were on deck for that kind of thing. But then when looking at other programs where you have something maybe more specific, like opioid prescribing, for instance, while it's not necessarily a small number of people, it is limited. I'm sure if anybody's familiar with REMS and RPC stuff, they do want to see those targeted opioid prescribers who have prescribed within the last 12 months. And so you're trying to be very hyper specific on your audience. And there are certain, audience numbers that perhaps aren't the right target audience. So they really aren't helping you close that gap that you've identified. If I have a dentist that takes an activity in COPD, sure, it's a learner, but what are the odds of my dentist treating COPD? I hope not. Anyway, Melissa, did you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it.
Awesome. So I think we actually ran a little bit ahead of time. We can open it to questions. Oh, it looks like we do have a question for small number argument is cool, but how if I'm a supporter, if I'm a supporter, how do I explain it to my review committee? So if you have smaller numbers that you submit to a supporter, but they're the right numbers, I guess that would be the bigger question. Can you identify who those learners are? And can you make the argument to your committee that this is the group that needs to be educated to close this gap? More is not always better, but in instances, obviously, there's a time and a place for those larger numbers for sure.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I don't think that I get that as an educational supporter, you want reach with your, the support. I understand that component, but if you're not hitting the right people, then how does that, like they say, how does that help? I mean, if you're ultra-dead and you want to, reach doctors, but instead it was all primary care physicians, did that really help? I mean, it seems like having the right target, even though it's smaller, would get the correct reach, not just reach. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Andrea?
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say, I think again, it goes back to those gaps and who we need to close those gaps on. I would think that the argument could be pretty strong if you were hitting smaller numbers, but you could show that it was the correct learners. I mean, sure, we all want bigger numbers all the time because bigger always feels better, but sometimes bigger is not always the most impactful when you're trying to do this. Melissa, did you have something to say?
Well, the only thing that I was going to say is that sometimes in smaller audiences, you have a lot more opportunity to do more interactivity, and the learning might stick a little bit better because the medium, which it tends to be video and print and things like that. So I think that these small group interactive work groups, the one that Carrie mentioned, had great impact. And I think it was a smaller number. So I think it really just depends on who, where, when, and what you're trying to accomplish. And I think you do have the ability to really hone in and show more performance types metrics on some of those really smaller type of programs.
if I can just add in as well from the supporter perspective, for those of you who don't know me, I'm in my day job, but I'm not doing CME Palooza. I work for Pfizer and the Global Medical Grants team. It can be a challenge. I think it often depends on the area that we are working in when this comes up more. For instance, I think you maybe Melissa even mentioned this, or I forget who, with COVID. A lot of the medical teams that I worked with when I was working in COVID were newer to the CME world when we started issuing RFPs and started doing programs. And for that reason, and also for the reason that something like that was so huge and widespread, that their focus really was on numbers, like number of participants, number of viewers, whatever it may be. And what they were looking for in the proposals that we received was big numbers. And so we had to have conversations about that on a number of different levels, not just, what's the difference between participants, viewers, that kind of thing, but also in how, programs that are showing lower numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean they're inferior inferior educational programs, and what were we looking for. So that was definitely a conversation that we had to have, and it can be a challenge sometimes when they're looking like, well, this one says there's going to be 50,000 people, and this one only says 300. Kind of, it's a little bit of an apples to oranges situation there. But anyway, that was just my 2 cents. I thought I'd add in.
Well, no, I agree, because I feel like that some of the conferences that I've done in the past, like when we asked for support from some of the grants and the different companies, we were very upfront with the fact that it wasn't going to be a large audience. I mean, we did one every year that was a really small group. There was only going to be about 30 people at the conference, but those 30 people were these specialists that were highly technical. And so, those different companies wanted the reach to that technical group. And it was hard to get a hold of them, of course, because they're in surgery all the time. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that as long as you're upfront with the fact there's only going to be 30 people, but it's the 30 people they want in your entire state, which is, completely happens in my state, then it is worth it, because without that, you probably wouldn't have that reach to those 30. The other part, Derek, I didn't know you had a day job. I thought you did this all the time. So
yeah, no good. It feels like it sometimes. Any other final comments before we wrap things up? All right. Thank you, all three of you. That was that was an enjoyable format. That was great. Whoever came up with the idea, you can all take credit for it. That was fun. A lot of nice interaction from the participants. Let me give my final 2 slides here, and everyone will have a few extra minutes to go and refresh. Again, as a reminder, when you have a chance, please take our CME Palooza Spring Survey. It's on the live page at the bottom. You can't miss it. It's big red print. It says, please take the survey. It's literally like 6 or 7 questions. It'll take you 30 seconds to do. We always value your feedback. And our next session coming up at noon Eastern. This is our lunch session, which is sponsored by Clinical Education Alliance, advancing and defining the value of CPD with data that are everything, everywhere, all at once. Talk about topical. We just watched that last week with my wife. We hadn't seen it yet. So great movie, and also a great session coming up. Yeah, we watched the movie, not the session. That wasn't very clear on that. So thanks again, everyone. Hey, the 3 of you hang on after I end the broadcast. I have a couple comments.
Okay, great.
And everyone else, thank you. You can refresh the screen on the live and go to the link for the next session, and we'll talk to all of you later on.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.